it's not surprising that I started to feel close to God in the garden. And many of the people that I talk to also tell me that they feel close to God in the garden. Because firstly, so much of what we do in the garden is done in the position of prayer. We get down to weed, we kneel, we pull out roots, and we feel we're pulling out sins and things from the ground. But just a very clear sense of the closeness of God. As we get into the Bible too, we start to discover God the gardener. It's interesting to me that the first thing that God does after completing creation, that we hear about at least, is that God digs a garden, the Garden of Eden, of course. And a friend of mine, a Hebrew scholar, said that the imagery of God creating that garden is the imagery literally of God getting down into the dirt and getting his hands dirty. And I think what a wonderful kind of imagery. And of course, as I've reflected on this, I've realized that actually in many ways, God's first act as a gardener wasn't even in that planting of Eden, but it was actually in the creation of humankind. Because as we read in Genesis 2 verse 9, what it says is that God took some earth and sculpted a human being and breathed into that human being, and the human being became alive. One of my favorite books about theology of gardening is a book called Making Peace with the Land by Fred Barnson and Norman Wurzbach. And they say in this book that God's first love is the soil. Without healthy soil and the fertility and food it makes possible, there would be no terrestrial life of any kind. God's love for us, described definitely in John 3:16 as God's giving of his Son to us, only makes sense in terms of God's love for the earth that sustains us. And you think about it, there is no part of this world that is as teeming with life as the soil is. In every square inch of soil, there are millions and millions of organisms, bacteria, protozoa, mites, and of course getting bigger and bigger, earthworms, snails, slugs, spiders, all kinds of life, teeming with life. And it's because of that life that, of course, the soil then gives life to everything in creation too. In a former life, I tell people I was a physician, and so I'm still always interested in different aspects of health. And part of the research that I've done has told me that exposure to the earth actually boosts our happiness and strengthens our immune system. Getting your hands dirty actually increases your serotonin levels. When you contact the soil, believe it or not, when you breathe in that wonderful loamy smell of the soil, it actually gives you a physical high because there are substances in the soil that really act as antidepressants, almost like a natural drug that is meant to make us happy. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that people all have to be gardeners, because you can get that same kind of feeling going through for a walk through the forest or in connection with nature in some way or other. But it does say that we are meant to be connected to God's creation. And it's interesting to me too, I don't know about you, but I never thought a great deal about the verse in John 15 verse 20, I think it is, where the commentary tells us that Mary comes and she thought Jesus was the gardener. And you look at that and you think, why does it matter? What is so important about the fact that she thought he was the gardener that it is recorded in the Gospel of John? And a theologian friend of mine told me that one of the reasons for this is that one of the ways of interpreting the Gospel of John is actually that it is aligned with the days of creation. And then, of course, the resurrection of Christ, which is when Mary meets him in the garden, he is literally the gardener of the new creation. And I think, wow, this is something that if I'd never gotten my hands into the dirt, I would probably have missed out on for the rest of my life. That not only is God, the creator, a gardener, but Jesus, the Savior, is also a gardener. And then the final imagery that I absolutely love in terms of gardens is in literally the last chapter of the Bible. The Bible begins with the creation of a garden, and it actually ends with the creation of another garden. And this is where we're going to end this session, because this is just such a wonderful imagery to finish with. That in Revelation, we end with the creation of another garden, of a garden city. And in this garden, everyone is provided for 12 months of the year. In Revelation 22, verses 2 and 3, we read, "On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations." It's just a wonderful imagery of God, the gardener, creating this beautiful garden city in which not only is everybody provided for, but in which they're provided for 12 months of the year, and in which they are healed by that very creation that God has given us in this garden as well.